This morning I continue the sermon series on the life of David. The series is called David, a Man After God's Own Heart. And this is part 6 in this series, and I've titled it The Pit of Despair. David joins the Philistines. I've called it the Pit of Despair. And this is one of those low points in David's life. We all have them. And there will be a couple more low points coming for David, but this is the first real low point in his life. And I want to read one verse again for you from 1 Samuel chapter 27, just verse 1. Then David said in his heart, "Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than that I should escape to the land of the Philistines." Grace be unto you and peace from God our Father and from our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, a little while back, my good old Uncle Ole had a really bad day. He was sitting at home eating dinner one night with his wife Lena when he heard his cell phone ringing in the living room where he had left it, and so he got up to answer it, and Lena heard him speaking for a couple of minutes, and then he came back into the kitchen, and when he came back in the kitchen, the tears were just running down his face, and Lena said, "What's the matter, Ole?" And Ole said, "That was somebody from the nursing home where my mother was living, and they told me that she just passed away." He said, "I knew this was going to happen sooner or later, but it's still really hard to think that she's gone. This is the hardest day of my life, Lena." And they sat there for a while with Ole quietly sobbing and Lena trying to comfort him. And then suddenly Ole's cell phone rang again. So he got up again. He went back into the living room to answer it. And again, he talked for a few minutes, and then he came back into the kitchen, and this time he was crying even harder. And Lena said, "What's wrong now, Ole?" And Ole said, "The worst day of my life just got even worse." And Lena said, "What do you mean? What's wrong?" And Ole said, "That was my brother Lars on the phone, and he told me that his mother just died too." Poor old Ole. That was a pretty bad day. But in our story for this morning, David is going to have a much more difficult time than Ole. In fact, David is going to get so down in this story, so depressed, that he is going to make a terrible mistake. A mistake that will separate him from his own people and will turn his heart away from God for a full 16 months. 1 year and 4 months, it says in the Bible. The title of my sermon is The Pit of Despair. The Pit of Despair. And that's what those 16 months are going to feel like for David. David will dig such a deep hole for himself that there is only one person who will be able to get him out of it. And that person, of course, is God. So let's take a look at the story and find out how David got himself into this pit and see if we can learn some lessons for our own lives today. The story begins with what I'm going to call deja vu all over again. Let me just take a couple of minutes to recap what has happened to David up to this point in his life. Remember that when David was just a teenager, he got a surprise visit from the great prophet Samuel. And Samuel came and anointed David with oil and told him that God had chosen him, young David, to be the next king of Israel. There was only one problem. Israel already had a king at the time, King Saul. But Saul had turned his heart away from God, and God had decided that he needed to replace Saul. And so Samuel, the prophet, said to David, "All you have to do is wait. God has chosen you to be the next king, so he will make it happen in his own time." Well, then about a year or so later, David, who now is probably only about 18 years old, we had that great story where he stood up to the challenge of the Philistine giant Goliath. And when David killed Goliath on that day, the army of Israel won the battle and drove the Israelites out of the Elah Valley. And Saul was overjoyed that they had won the victory, and he welcomed David, young David, into his army, even though he was only probably about 18 years old or so. So David, at this young age, was already on his way to the top. But as David became more popular in Israel over the next couple of years, Saul began to get more and more and more jealous and angry. On 2 different occasions, we heard when David was in King Saul's house in Gibeah, Saul threw a spear at him, trying to pin him to the wall. And both times, David was able to escape. Finally, David learned from his good friend Jonathan, who was the son of Saul. David learned that Saul had ordered his men to kill David. And so David eventually had to run. We went through all those stories. David had to run. And he ran all over the place. The first place that he ran to was the town of Ramah, and that was where the prophet Samuel was living with a community of other prophets. But Saul chased him there, and David ended up having to leave. David then tried to spend some time in the land of the Philistines. He knew Saul couldn't come there, but he was only a couple years past, maybe 3-4 years past his killing of Goliath, and the Philistines remembered that, and they kind of turned on him, and David barely escaped with his life. So he was only with the Philistines for a short time then. David then went to the town of Nob, where there was a community of priests. There was a little religious community there that David thought he could take sanctuary in, but Saul tracked him down there with the help of an evil man by the name of Doeg the Edomite. And when Saul arrived in Nob, when he was marching in, David had to run again. He fled there. Saul was so enraged that the priests of Nob had helped out David that he killed 85 priests who were living there because they had helped David. Now, not knowing what else to do, David finally fled to the wilderness of southern Judah. This was the area just south of where David had grown up in Bethlehem. It was an area where David had raised the family sheep. David took care of the sheep when he was a young boy. And so he knew the area very well. He knew the hills, he knew the valleys, he knew the caves. And when David went there, he was joined by 400 other men of Judah who were willing to help him stand up against King Saul. So now David's got a group of men with him. But Saul decided to follow David into the wilderness of Judah, chasing him from one hill to another, from one cave to another. And then one day a strange thing happened. David and his men were hiding in a large cave near En-Gedi, when Saul and his army came marching in and camped just outside the mouth of the cave. So David and his men were trapped. But then Saul came into the cave all alone to relieve himself, and this gave David an opportunity to kill him, but David didn't do it. Instead of killing Saul, while Saul was taking care of business, David snuck up to where Saul had hung his robe on the rock, and he cut off a piece of his robe. And when Saul left the cave, David then came out. He held up that piece of cloth from the robe of Saul, and he said, "Saul, I had the chance to kill you in that cave, and I did not. I am not your enemy." And Saul finally had a crisis of conscience. He realized what he was doing was wrong, and he wept, and he begged David for forgiveness, and he vowed to David, and he vowed to God that he would stop chasing David, that he would stop trying to hunt him down and kill him. And Saul took his army and he headed home. So David was no longer running from Saul, but he didn't really know what he was supposed to be doing. And last week I talked about how David and his little army, which now had grown to about 600 men, started patrolling the southern border of Israel. And they were protecting the border towns from foreign invaders, and they were protecting the flocks and the herds of the farmers who lived there. And it was a way to make a living because they got support from the farmers whose herds they protected. But it was a far cry from the direction that David had thought his life would go. David now is probably 26, 27, 28 years old, somewhere in there. And it has been probably a decade since Samuel had anointed him and told him he was going to be the next king. And David began now to get impatient. He was spinning his wheels here in the wilderness. And it was right at that moment that David got some really bad news. After a couple years of leaving him alone, he got the word that Saul was coming after him again. David and his men were camped in a region called the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul brought 3,000 of his best soldiers with him and marched south to hunt him down once again. And of course, Saul was breaking the vow that he had made to David, the vow that he had made to God when he said, "I will never come after you again." But here he was. For about the 10th time now, Saul is trying to kill David. And remembering what had happened last time, how David had the perfect opportunity to kill him, Saul was taking no chances this time. When they set up their camp in the wilderness, Saul, it says, put his campsite right in the middle, and he arranged the whole army around him to protect him. Now, David decided, I can't keep running from him. He's eventually going to catch me. I need to do something bold to assure Saul that I have no intention of harming him. And so in the middle of the night, David took one loyal soldier with him, a man named Abishai, who actually happened to be his nephew. He was the son of one of David's brothers. He took Abishai with him, and they snuck past the sentries, the lookouts of the soldiers of Saul, and they entered right into the middle of the camp of Saul. And God was with David that night. 1 Samuel 26:12 says that no one in Saul's army saw David and Abishai come into the camp because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen on them. So God kind of anesthetized them all. And they were just sawing logs, and David and Abishai snuck into the camp. And David crept right up to where Saul was sleeping on the ground, probably on like some sort of a cot or a pack of some kind. And he crept right up, and he saw Saul's water bottle sitting right next to his head, and his spear was stuck in the ground right where he was laying. And David took both the water bottle and the spear with him, and he snuck out of the camp. And when the sun came up the next morning, David stood on a nearby hilltop overlooking the camp of Saul, and he shouted down from the top of the hill. He said, "Saul, where is your spear and where is your water bottle?" And Saul looked around him, and he saw that they were gone. And at that moment, he knew the man on top of the hill was David. And just like he had before, Saul broke down, and he cried, and he shouted up to David. He said, "I have sinned against you, and I promise I will leave, and this time I will leave for good. I will never come after you again." He said, "Once again you could have killed me, but you spared my life a second time." So just like the last time, Saul took his army back home, and he stopped chasing David. And David was safe again, but he didn't feel safe. Like I said, it was deja vu all over again. And David was tired of running from Saul. He was tired of roaming around the wilderness. He was tired of waiting for whatever future God had in store for him. And those of you who have ever gone through a difficult time in your life, you know what it's like to feel weary in your heart and weary in your soul. That's where David was as he watched Saul's army march away. And at that moment of weakness, David made a monumental mistake. David turned away from God. Now, over the years, I have talked a lot about the summer of 1976 when my dad died of cancer and my best friend died in an accident. I was with him just 6 days after my dad died. I've talked about that, told that story and those stories. What I've never really talked about too much is the dark place that I went to emotionally in the months right after that happened. I was just a 14-year-old kid who had been praying every night that God would heal my dad. But of course, God didn't heal him, not physically anyway. God did heal him spiritually, which I've talked about, and as I grew older, I came to understand that spiritual healing of my dad was far more important than the physical healing that I had been praying for. But all I was thinking about at that time when I was a kid was that God had taken my dad away from me. And then right after he did that, just days later, God took my best friend away from me. And I was confused, and I was depressed, and I was very angry at God. And so I have at least a little sense of what David was feeling as he sat on that hilltop and saw Saul marching away and turned his face away from God. As David sat there, he said, "Now I will perish one day at the hand of Saul." He said, eventually Saul's going to come back, and eventually he's going to kill me. And so David made that fateful decision. He said, "There is nothing better for me than that I should escape to the land of the Philistines." He had tried that once before, I mentioned, but it didn't work out very well. At that time, the Philistines were not willing to welcome the man who had killed their champion Goliath. But things were different now. The Philistines now knew that Saul really was trying to kill David. They knew that David had a small army of his own, and he was on the run from Saul. And so David came to King Achish, the king of the Philistines, and he offered him a deal. He said, I won't live in the city with you, the royal city, the capital, Gath. He said, give me a city in the southern part of the country where my men and I can live with our families. And in return, what I will do is I will protect your southern border. So David said, let me move into Philistine territory. I'll go right way on the southern edge, away from the capital, and I'll take care of your southern border for you if you will protect me from Saul. That's the deal David made with Achish, the king of the Philistines. But it was a deal with the devil. You see, the Philistines did not just want David to protect their southern border. What they expected was that David and his men would earn their keep. You see, the way of the Philistines was to attack the cities and towns along the border of the neighboring countries, to haul away whatever loot they could find. The Philistines were kind of a pirate culture. That's why Israel constantly had clashes with them. They were always coming over and attacking Israelite towns. And so the Philistines expected, David, if we're going to give you sanctuary in our country, you're going to do this for us. So the Bible tells us that David and his men made raids against the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. They killed people. They stole things. And David also lied to King Achish. He was sending the king all of the goods that they were taking from these other people, and he was telling him that the stuff was from the towns of southern Israel. He said, I've been attacking the southern Israelite towns and taking these goods. He wasn't, but he was telling King Achish that, and King Achish thought, wow, David really has turned against his own people. Yeah, 2 thumbs up, for David. It was a very, very dark time for David. He was on the side of evil now. But as bad as it was for David and his men were incredibly loyal to David, that they went along with this. But as bad as it was for them, it was about to get even worse. Because the day finally came, you knew it was going to happen, the day finally came when King Achish and the Philistines were ready to launch a major offensive against Israel. And King Achish expected David and his men to be a part of it. The plan was to go north, make a northerly route, and attack the Jezreel Valley in northern Israel. The Jezreel Valley was and still is today called the breadbasket of Israel. It is a broad, flat valley with very fertile soil. To this day, it's still the best farmland in Israel. It's a beautiful sight. I remember coming out of the hills into the Jezreel Valley when I was in Israel, and you just see this big, wide valley, beautiful crops growing everywhere. It's amazing. And if the Philistines were to take the Jezreel Valley, if they could do that, it would be a crushing blow to the Israelites. And so now David doesn't know what to do. He's marching north, obeying orders. He's joining up with the main Philistine army, and his heart is filled with dread. He had joined the Philistines because he was tired of running away from Saul, but how could he take part in an attack on his own people? But fortunately, even in this dark time of David's life, God was watching out for him. God never left him. When David and his men entered the Philistine camp, the officers of the Philistines were alarmed. They went to King Achish and said, "What are these men doing here?" And Achish said, "I expect them to fight with us." And the officers told King Achish, "You cannot let these Israelites fight against their own people." Achish said, "David and his men have served me very well on the southern border. I trust David." But the officers stood their ground. And the commander of the army said to King Achish, "David and his men will not go into battle with us." He said, "You do not know what these men will do in a fight against their own people. Maybe in the middle of the battle they will turn around and start to fight against us." Well, faced with a mutiny from his officers, King Achish backed down. And he went to David and told David, he said, "You're going to have to sit this one out. Take your men, go back home. Go back home to the city that I gave you, the city of Ziklag." So David and his men marched back home to Ziklag, their town on the southern border of Philistia. And if you think this story can't get any worse for David, then you would be wrong. Because when they got back to Ziklag, the town didn't exist any longer. David had left a few of the older men behind to watch over the town and the women and the children. But the town was pretty vulnerable while they were gone. And so while David and his men were gone joining the Philistine army, the Amalekites who lived in the desert south of the Philistine land, they decided this would be a good time for a raid. And while David and his men were gone, the Amalekites attacked Ziklag, and they easily overwhelmed the few men who were there, who were left behind to guard the town. And they took those men and all of the women and the children and all of the possessions, and they headed south toward the Egyptian border. They took everything. And as they were leaving the little town of Ziklag, David's town, they burned it to the ground, burned all the houses, all the structures to the ground. When David and his men returned home, they found Ziklag in ashes, and all of their family members and all of their possessions were gone. And at that moment, David fell all the way to the bottom of the pit of despair. 1 Samuel 30, verse 4 says that David and the men who were with him raised their voices, and what a sad phrase this is. They wept until they had no more strength to weep. I remember that time right after my dad died when I felt that darkness in my soul, and I was doubting whether God was really out there, and if he was, whether he really cared about me at all. And then something happened a few months later. I've never told this story in a sermon before. It's very intensely personal, but when I think about it today, I can still kind of feel the emotions of that time. At the time my dad died, we owned this little hardware store in a small town in Wisconsin. One of the things that we sold, we were a hardware store, we sold paint. So we had this nice, shiny paint mixing machine, and it had all of those cylinders with the different colors of tint in them. And with those tint colors, you could mix any color on the paint charts that we had. And needless to say, the tints in those cylinders were very expensive. And one day, my mom decided that she wanted to rearrange the store a little bit, the floor. I wanted to move things around. One of the things that she wanted to do, she wanted to move the paint mixing machine to a different corner. And so she gave that job to me and my older brother, Bob. And as we were moving that paint machine that day, I remember I was holding on to it, and I could feel the edge of it kind of, I had enough strength to hold it, but it was kind of cutting into my hand. And when I felt that pain, all of a sudden I dropped one of my hands, dropped the end. And that corner of the paint machine hit the floor, and I spilled out hundreds of dollars worth of that tint on the floor. And we didn't have a lot of money. To replace those tints was going to be very expensive. And my mom was upset with me. My brother yelled at me like older brothers always do. I don't hold it against him. And I ran out of the store, ran out the back door, ran to the garage. We had a old detached garage in the backyard, an old barn-like garage. And I climbed up into the musty old attic of that garage, and I sat there in the darkness, and I just started to weep. I mean, it was the first time that I had cried since the horrible events of that summer. It had been months, and I hadn't cried a tear. I was trying to be tough, you know. But in that moment, when I was alone in that garage attic, it just all came gushing out. All of the pain, all of the confusion, all the anger, all the doubt, it all came out. And that moment was my pit of despair. And that moment kind of came rushing back to me this week when I read that line in this story. They wept until they had no more strength to weep, because I've experienced that, and some of you have as well. I know that. So David had made this terrible mistake in his moment of weariness, his moment of doubt. He had turned away from God. He lived in that dark pit for 16 horrible months. And it all kind of culminated in this one terrible moment as David and his men sat weeping in the ashes of their town. And then a remarkable thing happened. In that moment of his greatest darkness, as he sat in the pit of despair, David turned back to God. There's a sentence in 1 Samuel 30. It was the one I used in the children's sermon. Doesn't sound like anything profound, but one of the most beautiful sentences in the Bible. 1 Samuel 30, verse 6, the last part. The beginning of that verse, it's a long verse. The beginning of the verse said, as David's men were weeping, some of them were grumbling. They were talking about stoning David to death for leading them down this dark path. They were kind of turning on David. And then the second part of the verse says, but David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. I'll never forget what happened when I was all alone in that dark, dusty garage attic. At that moment, I suddenly felt the presence of God just filling me up. If you've ever experienced that before, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, it would be hard to explain what it feels to suddenly just be filled by God. And this happened on a Sunday afternoon when I dropped that paint mixer. And when I went to school the next day on Monday, I talked to one of my asked one of my teachers if I could talk to him during the lunch hour. I was going to a Lutheran high school up in Wisconsin at the time, and the teacher there, he was the assistant pastor at one of the local churches, but he also taught a few classes at our high school. And he was my Latin teacher. Maybe that's why I love Latin to this day. But he was my Latin teacher. He was also my freshman basketball coach, and I felt very close to him. And I told him what I had been going through in those past few months, and then I told him what had happened over the weekend, how I dropped the paint mixer and how I just sunk into it, that despair, and then how God had come to me. I said I just knew in that moment that I wasn't alone anymore. And I'll never forget what he said back to me. He said, Bill, there was never one moment when you were really alone. He said, you turned your face away from God for a while, but God never turned his face away from you. He was just waiting for you to turn back to him because he loves you so much, and he has an amazing future in store for you. From that moment on, I've never doubted God in my life, never doubted his presence. Always felt him right here. And in our story for today, when David turned back to God and was strengthened by God, then the old David was back. When he got up from his weeping and his prayers, what he did was he rallied his men together. He shook off the despair, and he said, we've got to go and get our families and our goods back. And they went after the Amalekites, and they went fast, and they caught up to them very near the Egyptian border. The Amalekites were nomads, and they were probably heading for the Egyptian border, knowing if they could get into Egypt, then they were home free. But David and his men caught them before they got to Egypt. And they defeated them in battle, and they brought back all of their wives, all of their children, all of their possessions. 1 Samuel 30, verse 19 says, nothing was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything that had been taken. David brought back all. Charles Swindoll talks about this dark period in David's life, a period that lasted, as I said, for 16 months. He says that we know from the Bible that David was a prolific songwriter. David wrote more than half of the Psalms that are in the Bible. He wrote them for almost every occasion in his life. But Swindoll says not one of David's Psalms was written during this dark period. His music left him when he turned his face away from God. But after David came out of the darkness, his music came back to him. And one of the Psalms that David wrote was Psalm 40. And we don't know for sure that he wrote it about this dark period in his life, but I would say it's a pretty good possibility. And let me read for you just the first 3 verses. If you want to, you can look it up and read the rest. It's kind of a longish psalm. You can look it up and read the whole thing on your own. But let me read for you Psalm 40, verses 1 to 3. This is what David wrote after he came out of that pit of despair. He said, I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry. He drew me up from the pit of destruction, out of the miry bog, and set my feet upon a rock, making my steps secure. He put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord. Now, those sound very much like the words of a man who was rescued from the pit of despair. Now, next week, we're going to turn our attention to the north because that battle between the Philistines and the Israelites is still going on. David and his men had to go down and deal with the Amalekites, but that battle happened. And that battle is going to be the end of Saul and the beginning of David's rise to the throne. And the title of my sermon next week will be, they're the words of David, a phrase spoken by David, how the mighty have fallen. And I hope you can be with us here next week. Amen and amen.